Okay, just as people take their seats, I might just get started. So I know I'll get in trouble with Anna if I'm not timely. My name is Alan March. I'm based here in the faculty, obviously part of the research team behind this, and I know there's more people behind this than just the research team, to be honest, as Anna pointed out, and no doubt we'll thank at the end. This session is somewhat daunting to me because it's about capabilities, and essentially we're talking about human capabilities, and I'm just a little old town planner, urban designer guy who's now, being a researcher in a university setting. And when I start to think, particularly looking at, listening and thinking on the discussion we had this morning, the breadth of understanding, the breadth of knowledge that is needed is really very daunting, but we can rise to the challenge, of course. So we're going to focus in a little bit on the built environment professionals here, but acknowledging that following a thread from this morning, that will change and that there are many other people involved. So that can be part of this conversation as well. So recent research highlights gaps in knowledge, skills and capacities of many professionals across the numerous sectors that are involved. This includes in our own work, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. This theme will discuss how the climate change capabilities of built environment professionals can be developed and maximised to meet the scale and pace of action required. It's kind of why I'm feeling a bit daunted. There's lots to do. The discussion will consider the development of practitioners' capabilities and the ways that innovation, professional agency and an engaged public can be integrated within complex regulatory and financial settings. The session will culminate in the development of a built environment climate charter, which is in the next session, so I'm sort of trying to prime that. We just had a session setting out some starting principles. It's a very lofty goal, but we thought, why don't we start? Because that's how things happen. And Jane, who's going to, will talk no doubt a bit about her contribution, which is a large one, to that as well. So we have the research project, as we talked about before. Objective 3 of that project, as you've probably read, was to assess how prepared built environment professionals are. That was based on just about 150 interviews with practitioners around Australia, relatively proportional to the size of the states and with a pretty good gender balance. Some key findings, and you can see here, looks a bit blurry to me, but hopefully you can get a link straight through without a paywall, straight through to some papers there. And something that I think is great in this project is that we've tried to use some good graphics as well that will sort of speak to various people in various formats. And so hopefully you'll see them in those papers. So I'm going to talk pretty briefly about this because we have an amazing panel poised over here, and really it's about hearing from them. But some of the things we found, and again, following a theme from this morning, these sort of two-sided aspects. So the context of regulation, finance and timing. Regulatory frameworks, this is what practitioners reported in these interviews. Regulatory frameworks did provide them sometimes with the opportunity to take strong action that felt as if it was going in the right direction. But similarly, when that wasn't there, they felt a loss of agency and an inability to act. And again, sometimes they would act anyway. So there's nuance there, and I think that's where we need to dig in and hopefully we can talk about more. Being able to make a financial argument was very helpful. Co-benefits, if that's one way of talking about it, so I guess it's not just financial. However, similarly, Georgia was talking about this earlier, and indeed others, sometimes the finance, the economics just pushed climate change action absolutely aside. Agency and finance. When professionals were able to take action, they embraced the opportunity. We probably had a skewed group towards people who were very interested, I suppose. This could be within an organisation, in the public setting, within a project, you know, the essence of that, I suppose, is that providing the opportunity for a professional to do so. Leadership, and I include fellowship in there as well, as in, you know, being able to follow a good lead, having the tools, having the knowledge, having the ability and the agency to do that. Many of the practitioners reported that, you know, there were key firms, key individuals, it might be within their own agency or organisation, really were very inspiring and would provide a lead. And I think if we could do more of that, it would really, really help. Maybe it's part of our role as academics to get those stories out there along with the professions. The other thing that came out quite strongly is that if roles are created for people within organisations, small firms or large firms, that really meant that climate change action was on the table. It was at the meeting, it was on-site visit. And if those people didn't have a role, they felt they had less legitimacy to raise things, or it might just be forgotten about in the hurly-burly doing of things that happens in, you know, design offices and planning studios, etc. And the final one there, knowledge and education, there was a real thirst we found in the responses to our interviews for good quality and usable information that I guess you go from the very scientific down to the how do I choose the material, or how do I even know this product is what it says it is when I'm about to put it on a facade, for example. And so having that set of knowledge, it could be an online dashboard, or it could be some, you know, a spreadsheet where you can plug things in, and indeed to be able to skill yourself up. So that came out very strongly. So you'll find that and more in those papers, and I'll now like to invite our wonderful panellists to come forward and take a seat. And here are their names. I'm being prompted. And I'll give a very brief introduction when I find out what order people are in. Anna Hancock on the end is Executive Director of Pollination Group. Jonathan Spear is the Chief Executive Officer of Infrastructure Victoria. Karen Kane is Director of Transition and Recovery Australia. And we have Natasha Palich from MAV and CASB, and I always get this acronym wrong, Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment. And we have Jane Cassidy, who is the National President, Australian Institute of Architects, amongst other things. And I know all our panellists have a few roles, so I've chosen maybe the most pertinent ones. There we go. I've invited the panel to give a brief bit of commentary on, and I provided some provocation questions of what they think is important or an important point to make from their perspective. And it might be from their own role or from their observation across this huge and diverse sector. So maybe, Anna, if we started with you, because I saw you on the end. And then after the panellists make their comments, I'll invite questions from the floor.
Terrific. So pleasure to be here. Many of the people that you will have heard from today will be speaking from the perspective of the built environment, whether that's precincts, design, materials, planning, and reaching into elements of sustainability and sharpening practice, accessing new technologies from that perspective. I come to you from the other side. I'm an energy transition person. I've spent 25 plus years in heavy industry and the power generation and power supply sectors. And I am looking at cities and design as an extension of the power system. And increasingly, I put it to you that the two are indistinguishable. Over the months of this year to date, output from rooftop solar that is not used behind the meter but is sent out into the grid has made up over 11% of the power generation circulating in the East Coast system that we call the NEM. And that's almost 30% of the total renewable energy supply circulating in the system. So that is not an insignificant volume. And if you overlay a unknowable quantity of electricity consumption that goes on behind the meter that's powered within those buildings, whether dwellings or buildings of other types, and if you overlay on top of that elements of roof design, of appliance and insulation choices that ultimately shapes how much energy is consumed and when it's used, you have a really material component of the power system that is resident in distributed built assets. And on this basis, I've got a few comments about key skills that I see as relevant, but one is a level of literacy to act with responsibility as energy system professionals, and to consider implications for adjacent investments in assets, to consider how your thinking and planning and deployment end up impacting peaks and troughs in energy consumption, and to do what you can to level out energy usage as much as possible. Second point I'd want to make is that city shapers also need a working grasp of emissions accounting principles and interactions with the physically changing climate. This is a topic that is really dear to my heart. I'd love to return to it if I'm granted leave to do that later. I've got some particular perspectives that relate to the built environment in use of liquid fuels, in particular the gas replacement and the hydrogen conversation. And it's really important that professionals keep a leading eye on emissions accounting insights, because we're sharpening our understanding in the climate community. There's, I think you've referred to in your introduction, Ellen, the difficulty that some consumers face in paying for change out of infrastructure and appliances, and that's a very, very pressing point. In that context, regulatory settings are so central. And so the skill set really needs to involve and include the ability to advocate and navigate regulations to achieve shifts in regulation that include such things as requiring buildings to be electrification ready with appropriate meting and wiring, even if the occupant insists on retaining their gas connection. Those sorts of things don't happen without regulation, and so that regulatory lens is so important. And then my final vote for key skills really is that we need what I call solution workers, but people that can unlock the bulk uptake of newer and lower emissions and energy responsive technologies. This isn't some demonstration case or an outlying edge design that is a really elegant solution. These are workers that can interface with the existing systems, whether they're electricity retailers, power networks, mass bulk builders who deploy huge swathes of housing, and that can find a way to thread the needle that makes the investment case add up by adding the layers of value that you can create by doing things differently. So those solution workers are absolutely needed to unlock bulk investment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I'll just mention, I should have said this before, because I'm very bad at looking at a small telephone and reading it, and indeed technology, we will have a roving mic at the end. Hopefully we'll get some time for questions from the floor, and maybe it'll change things up a little bit. Jonathan, you have overview of a very large and important agency. What are your sort of top tips or challenges or insights?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. So just for clarity, so Infrastructure Victoria is the state's independent infrastructure advisor. So we give advice to the current government, but also the Victorian Parliament, so all parties of the Parliament. And so we do that looking across lots of areas of infrastructure that the Victorian government has some interest in. And I think one of the ways to come into this question around, well, what skills and capabilities do we need as a profession is to think about, well, where are we headed in terms of policy on decarbonisation of infrastructure? And I was lucky enough to catch some of the panel session that was just before from some of the professional organisations where the point was being made that the setting of policy and clarity of policy is really important in terms of how we achieve what we want to achieve and how to drive that. And another way of putting that is, some of the biggest opportunities to reduce emissions, but also to make our infrastructure more adapted, is right up front. Once decisions have been made and we're in the kind of build and operation phase, we certainly have opportunities to reduce emissions and be more resilient, but they're diminishing opportunities. So work we've done, but also colleagues in other professional associations and other infrastructure advisory bodies have been looking at how do we reduce the embodied and enable emissions of all the infrastructure that we build and operate. And of course, there's billions of dollars that governments are pouring into infrastructure, and that's responsible for 70–80% of the emissions that we have across the country, depending upon how you want to count it. But there's a hell lot of emissions in that steel and concrete for a start. So what we've been looking at is, well, how would a government like the Victorian government, with its billions of dollars of investment, work its way through to reduce its emissions and therefore start heading towards its pretty ambitious emission reduction targets? So first thing is thinking really hard about, do we build anything? Because there's all sorts of ways that we can meet the infrastructure needs that Victorians have. And it's not always about building new stuff. So there are certainly opportunities for us to think about changes to the way that we deliver services, making better use and continuing to operate the infrastructure we already have, how we price it, what technologies we use to get more out of it. So there's all sorts of ways to think about that before we then go and build. And that's something that doesn't always come first to the minds of people in government. So there's a key capability that we need to have, is thinking about, well, what are all the ways that we can squeeze more out of the infrastructure we've got to meet the needs of the community. Sometimes we're still going to need to build some stuff. And so then the question is, well, how do we construct it in a way that actually does take and measure the carbon that we're going to embody and enable through that? So that's things like being skilled at quantification of carbon, so measurement of carbon and costing of carbon. And so there's a whole bunch of different tools that are out there. The problem isn't that we have tools, is we've got so many tools. So being clear about which tools we're using and the inputs of those tools, that's a key skill, as is applying them in cost-benefit analysis, because that's what governments are increasingly moving towards, and the infrastructure ministers have recently agreed to nationally is they're going to move towards that. Then when governments make decisions about investing in new infrastructure, one of the things you're likely to start to see is increasing requests in the quotes to give a sense of how can you deliver a design that has reduced embodied and enabled emissions. And that's something that hasn't been there that much recently. There's been a real disconnect. And so increasingly there's going to need to be a capacity to go, well, if we build it business as usual, it'll be X amount of emissions, but we can give you Y amount of emissions while still delivering the function that we need. So there's a key skill, and some of that's going to be in the digital skills to actually model that up and show that. Then it needs to drive through the procurement process even further so that there is auditing and implementation and monitoring and delivery of those new ways of delivering the infrastructure with the low in carbon. And sometimes that's going to involve using new materials and new methodologies. So there's some skills we need to have as well. And this is skills on the part of government as well, to understand the opportunities and the risks and be willing to bear some of those, as well as in industry. And so there's a real opportunity for those of you in industry to support government in understanding that. Then the most important thing, as we know in the world, are lawyers. I think it's a really good way to make sure I get kicked out of this building really quickly. But the lawyers need to have the skills to draft the contracts that actually drive through the deal, right? So if the deal is we're going to have a lower carbon build and construction and operation, then the contracts have to reflect that and have the right amounts of carrot and stick. And there's actually some really good examples that are out there for us to be using. Head across the square, talk to your friends in the law school, because actually that's going to be really important too. Not just in the initial phase, but making sure that those contracts are able to adapt as the capabilities in industry adapt with the new techniques and the new understanding about what works and how it works over time. Because infrastructure is a long-lived beast, and the contracts need to reflect that too. And then you might even want to hang out with some auditors. I don't really like hanging out with auditors, but the auditors need to make sure that all those promises and all those things and all those reduced emissions that we wanted to have are actually being achieved. So we're going to need to have some methodologies to do that. Now, the good news is that this move towards reducing emissions in our infrastructure is being reflected in international accounting standards. And there's going to be increasing requirements that there be reporting of emissions and of climate-related risk by big companies. So the auditors and the accountants are starting to get on board to this too. So part of the skill then is going to be multidisciplinary operation, not just across the built environment, but with those other areas that are going to really enable some of this in policy, strategy, legal and accounting and auditing.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Because you raised the spectre of auditors, I thought I might try and stop you, because you might bring up financiers next or something of that nature. But thank you very much. Karen, you bring to this a regional perspective, so I'd be very interested to hear your take on this. Push it upwards.
Thanks very much, Alan, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. Yes, I will bring a regional perspective to this, but I will also draw on some international work as well. So just following on from the conversation we've had, you know, what we're talking about today is how do we succeed in creating the best conditions to tackle climate change. And what I have learnt in two roles, one as the CEO of the Latrobe Valley Authority for 5 years, and now working with the state government on forestry transition after the finish of commercial logging in our native forests, and how important we're talking about nature today and how important biodiversity is, and working with our traditional owner colleagues on that in that area. I'm going to bring those two things together in a moment. But working at the authority, I got to work internationally as well to find out what was happening around the world in terms of transition, you know, everything from just transition to thriving regions. And it's really important for us to draw on the knowledge base that we can find in other places. I think it's a really good message for us here today. But I just want to pick up on the things that I did learn. Really important, and I've heard these words today, the two key words in terms of what I've learnt and what we tried to do well was to collaborate and innovate and explore new ways of working together and problem solving. And it requires behaviour and system change. And we actually worked out a way of monitoring that change over time through observation of people's behaviour. And so if anybody's interested in that, I'm very happy to share that at some stage, because it's what people do, what decisions they make, what organisations do, and are led by people, that makes the change, right? So we really need to understand that, and how do you observe and those changes occurring, and how can you actually record that and think about what change then you need to put in place, or what else needs to happen. Probably from work I did with the EU and the team did with the EU, we had a partnership with the EU through Gippsland region, which was fantastic. Is that the built environment's important as long as its purpose and use is targeted to what matters to people and the environment, and how it's going to benefit both of those. But probably what was really important learning was that what makes some places thrive and others not. While infrastructure is important, it's not sufficient. So what else do we need to pay attention to? So there were 5 core pieces of research that have come out of the EU Research Centre in the last 5 to 10 years that really make a difference to transition and what we're talking about here today. Collaboration and partnership across sectors, and I've heard people talking about that today. Very, very important. We've got to work together and across sectors, because it's all of the things we're talking about here around climate action change, we've got to work on together. And I've heard this today, and it's been great to hear some of the conversations. Entrepreneurial discovery and innovation. We've got to find where our entrepreneurs are. There are people out there that we don't even know about doing wonderful things. So how do you find where they are? How do you connect to them? And you do that through your networks. But we've got to go to the not usual suspects sometimes. And there are some hidden gems out there that we haven't found yet. And they don't have to be, our traditional organisations either. So, and that can happen in a department, it can happen as an individual, it can happen in a large organisation, but we have to know of them and we've got to partner with them. They're doing some really good work. The third one is the strength of institutional capability. And I was talking to someone today, I think, yes, on this panel about small councils. They really struggle to do what's needed of them because they don't have the resources. But it's not just about resources. If we're working with organisations that are still doing business as usual, because that's the way they've always worked, then the institutional capability there is part of the partnership work. And it's not being judgmental, it's about how do we shift the way people think and do their work. The fourth one is how decisions are made and on what and who with whom, and the really important role of multi-level governance. So when I say multi-level governance, I'm talking vertical and horizontal. So everything from decisions that governments make through their processes and boards and on organisations, through to those horizontal informal governance arrangements where you can have discussions with people and learn about things and form some decision-making information and have people involved. It's all of that. And I can't stress enough how important that is for people in communities across Australia, not only in regional Victoria and Australia, but also within our urban environment. You've got very active people in communities who want to be involved. The last one is about demonstration of new ways of working at a local and practical level. And I just want to give you 2 examples. So the authority had a $266 million budget, a lot of money, came through the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Part of that funding was for built infrastructure in response to the closure of the Hazelwood mine and generating, new economic opportunities. So, swimming centre was a big build, and the second stage of the local hospital were 2 big builds, multi-million-dollar builds. So we could go down the old path and we get the architects in, and they do the design, and thank you very much, the board signs that off. We worked with local council, we worked with the boards of those 2 organisations, we worked with the unions, we worked with the building industry, We worked with the government departments who were connected to those two big builds, and sustainability was the main game. And how do we reduce costs? How do we reduce the impact, the build impact? We brought all of those agencies together, and the brief to the architect was we need local procurement for the work. So for the regional hospital, 85% were local businesses. That didn't just happen by chance. Same for the swimming centre. The last point I want to make here is you actually can influence regulation, and I'll tell you how that can happen. So if money's involved and it's going to be cheaper, government usually is really interested in that. So how can we reduce the costs associated with an ongoing infrastructure? So this comes to the energy piece. So geothermal heating is a really important source that sits within the Latrobe Valley, just sitting underneath the coal layer. It's not very far down, and it's actually accessible in a sustainable way. So we set to work to find out how we could influence regulation to allow the heating of the very large swimming pools at the swimming centre using geothermal. And it's done. It's the first time. And yes, thank you very much. And the regulators changed the regulations to allow that to happen. Why? Because it was sustainable, it was cheaper, and there's new equipment and technology sitting there that's enabling that to happen. Now, the other really important bit about demonstration here is if you want to change people's opinion about sustainability, renewable energy and climate change action, every person involved in that process now understands that. And now there is support for looking at new ways of new energy in this community. 8 years on, the last bit. 8 years on, we've just had a New Energy Conference in Gippsland, the largest regional conference in Australia, which I attended for 2 days. It was fantastic. You know, the thinking has changed, the support has changed, local councils are getting right behind this. It's the biggest change, and I've lived in the valley, worked in the valley for 26 years, the biggest change I have ever seen. So it is possible, but those conditions that I talked about take skill and capability, and you have to learn how to do that work. And we set out to learn ourselves about how to be creative and how to undertake innovation and participation. We do have some academic partners who can help with this, who we've been working with, and I think universities can help us understand how to do this work really well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a lovely, positive story, and you said good things about academics, so I feel very pleased. Thank you. So we better keep moving because two more important speakers. Natasha, you bring a great perspective here from MAV, the people who do a lot of the work on the ground, local government, of course, and indeed CASPI. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Kelly Grigsby, who was going to be talking here, sends her apologies, and I am her stand-in for the day. So my name is Natasha Palish. I'm a MAV employee. I am the executive officer of CASBI, which is an alliance of councils that's hosted by and auspiced by the MAV. We have a dedicated work plan. My comments today are not so much about what we need to learn, but more a comment on how we can learn. So until recently, I was an architect. I say that I was an architect. I'm a non-practicing architect right now. I'm also an alumni of this university. In my early career, I oscillated between practice and advocacy roles, including a position at the Institute of Architects. But for the past 20 years, I've done both at the same time, part-time. And one of the things I've learned from this background is that we learn best from our peers. The built environment professionals, I think, don't have a very easy job. It's hard, and it's getting harder to procure a building in Australia. The trade-off, of course, is safe, and by that I include climate resilience, safe and structurally sound buildings. Look, and while I think, just drawing on comments from earlier today, well, I think there's more to be done. I think we're on the way. Our regulation is changing. It's also hard for people working in the climate change space for obvious reasons. I think capacity building is best achieved in a practical, interactive and outcomes-driven way, and I'm going to give you two examples of that. So more than 20 years ago, I was involved in setting up the Sustainable Architecture Forum, which started in Victoria. It was originally a forum that met quarterly, and then as part of that, in addition to those quarterly meetings, and I'm just got sidetracked because I just seen one of the people that was involved back then sitting in the audience. But as part of that forum, we had the 3 working groups. And so these working groups would work in between on specific topics. They supported policy development for the Institute of Architects. They developed shared resources for the sector, and they developed peer-led capacity building. So I think that was a hugely successful role because it was created and led and delivered by and delivered to peers. The second example I'll give is the MAV, of course. So the MAV is the Victorian umbrella organisation for local government, and it establishes that connection between councils. And if Kelly was here, she would have talked about the work that's occurring at the executive and councillor level, the capacity building, the drawing together, the networking, the creation of forums for people at that level. I, however, facilitate connection and capacity building at the officer level, so the bureaucrats and the workers. And the network that I look after has run under the politics, if you like, for many, many years. And the values and the forces that are embedded in our network are used by the members of our group to feed back up into the politics of their individual councils to garner support. And so I think that there's role for people, for people to hold a space to enable that community of practice, to create a place where people with shared values can come together and an understanding that everybody has something to teach and everybody has something to learn. So to summarise, I think there's 2 key points to capacity building. One is that there's a need for a connection between shared teaching and learning. And the second is to connect learning with practical outcomes driven, to make learning practical and outcomes driven. And something else I've learnt from my architectural practice doing small renovations with a limited budget is that every little thing helps. So every good decision makes a difference. And so I agree that we're at the point where we need evolutionary systemic change, and our work at CASB is focused on achieving that. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that our global silver bullet is hundreds and thousands and millions of good decisions.
Very, very wise words, and it really resonates with me in combination with your suggestion that there are these roles that we need to encourage to bring people together and to communicate. I think that's something that really activates this kind of action, doesn't it? Our final and most important speaker. No, I'm really joking because I'm a town planner and we're taught that you should never give the final word to an architect, and I'm breaking that rule. Jane, you lead one of the most important built environment professions. I'm very keen to hear what you say.
Thank you, and hopefully my notes will keep me on time. So imagine a transformation of unprecedented scale, I think rivaling the Industrial Revolution itself. The transformation is centred on that shift to a net zero carbon, circular economy future. That challenge is currently unfolding against the backdrop of inflation, housing affordability challenges, supply chain challenges, intergenerational equity challenges, and a revolution in the way organisations are structured and how people work. So slightly big challenge. And the world is moving faster than ever before, but I got to say it's never going to move this slowly again. All right, so the cliff is just going to get bigger if we don't jump off. I think the opportunity is kind of how do we adapt to the ever-accelerating pace of change and provide those solutions that are demanded by our planet and its people. This summer is probably going to be the hottest we've ever experienced. It's also going to be probably the coldest we will ever experience again. So we stand as the vanguards in an era of transformation. We're charged with not only adapting but thriving. So I think we've really got to foster an environment that boosts investment confidence and sparks innovation through low carbon outcomes. And that's really about shifting from a principles-based approach to measurement. And that's about measuring sustainable results. So, look, the good news is that architects and engineers are really good at measuring. It's something we do really well. We just haven't been measuring this particular thing very well. So consider the potential, I think, as we pivot to that low carbon future. Leveraging digital transformation and amplifying the value of architecture in solving the challenges of our times. I think imagine this future underpinned by a circular economy where existing buildings and renewables become the future city's resource library. Imagine our BIM models and our material data as really fundamental to that future with ever-increasing value. Imagine architects' complex technical skills having enhanced value in the reweaving, remaking and the evolution of cities where we do more with less. Imagine as architecture and engineering engages with the whole asset life cycle, including disassembly and reuse. So I don't know about you, but I think one of the big challenges is that it takes a really long time to deliver a big building or grow a precinct. And we've got to adapt at the speed of change and deliver really timely, affordable and resilient outcomes at pace. The good news is the Institute has endorsed the Industry Decarbonisation Roadmap, and we've done that alongside some of our partners at ASBEC and the GBCA. And I spoke to all of the building ministers across each of the state and federal portfolios yesterday about that. And there's a really great buy-in at all levels. In more good news, in June, Australia's building ministers resolved to incorporate embodied carbon in the 2025 NCC as a voluntary pathway. Consistent measurement is absolutely fundamental to the way forward, and we've got to make sure that we're all using the one measuring system, and that creates the pathway forward for that. We've also launched the Institute's low carbon curriculum, and we've done that in partnership with the Department of DQ, Climate Change, Energy and Water and all of the other things, which has been really fantastic. But I think all of those things are great, but I think one of the biggest things we've got to do is get more investment in that early phase carboneering tools. So the first 5% of a project is absolutely critical, and we've got to create some benchmarks. We've got to get it incorporated in the business case of every business case that government incorporates. And I think, look, our profession has faced a gradual erosion of its role over time, with other professions really encroaching on the sorts of roles that architects are really well equipped to handle. And I think, while acknowledging the value of all of those other professions, we've been really strong contributors to that shift. I think we've got to really shift the vocabulary that we use. It's elitist. We've got to shift the sort of way that we communicate about architecture. We've spent far too long with beautiful, glamorous images, and that is really undermining the sorts of technical, really important skills that architects bring to solving the future challenges. That's
so inspiring, and I'll take back what I said before. highly appropriate that you had the final word. I think one of the things you said really really hit me. Things are moving really fast, but they'll only get faster, or this is as slow as it's going to get. And that call to action and that acknowledgement in the face of this huge challenge is really quite sobering. But combined with the very positive measures you're taking, and indeed with our speakers, I actually feel a great sense, our other speakers, I feel a great sense of positive possibility here for more change. Now, we've got a few minutes. I think we might just have like one or two questions. And Anna, would you do me the favour of identifying a hand or two if someone wants to ask a succinct question, and we might need to steal a microphone and share them amongst our speakers. So if you could just say who you are and make a short comment or a short question, but in the style that perhaps our panel could respond to, please.
Do I? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sadie Broda. I'm a law student, and I had a question for both Jonathan and Karen. Working in the government space, and obviously as a law student, I learn a lot about regulation and policy. Do you think it's a fundamental problem in our current political system that both the Liberal, let's bit political, so sorry, that both the Liberal and Labour parties have ties to unions and to carbon industry in their funding? And do you think that's stopping any sort of climate action happening in politics?
Okay, that was a fairly direct question, so I'll let...
Well, why don't I ask it this way to bring it back to the subject of this session. So this is not about necessarily whether we build stuff. And obviously there is a whole bunch of organisations and firms and individuals who have incentives for stuff to get built, right? What we've got an opportunity here to do in thinking about decarbonisation and adaptation of our buildings and our infrastructure is to think through, well, what type do we need to build versus adapting them or reusing them, which actually gives, a whole lot of different sort of jobs. And that's one of the things that we pointed out, and our advice to government is that actually when you look at the future jobs for this century and setting up Victorian industry, looking at the way in which the built industry is going to work in future, there's actually a whole lot of opportunities here. It's just that they look a little bit different to how things are done now. And so, that's the real opportunity, but we're not going to achieve the big goals that we've got in terms of emissions reduction or make better use of the infrastructure we've already got at a time when finances are tight, unless we do some things differently. And there's a really interesting synergy between emissions reduction, cost reduction, and productivity as well. And so that's where there's the big opportunity for governments. But Karen, did you want to add to that?
Thank you. Good question. Unions, let's talk about that. So unions occur at a national level, they occur at a state level, they occur at a local level. So, and there are divisions within unions and across unions. I mean, they're like any other organisation. They don't all agree on things, and perhaps what I'll say is a really practical thing. So I come back to demonstrate what's possible. So we went and knocked on the door of the Trades and Labour Council in Gippsland and said, we need you. We've got workers who are going to be losing their jobs. We need you. How can you work with us to help those workers and their families? They're members of our community. So you can do that. So a partnership, I'll come back to the word about partnership. How do you bring organisations together to find solutions and share and build trust? So we got that Trades and Labour Council, we got the local TAFE, we worked with the energy companies that we were dealing with, we worked with adult education. We supported that alliance to do some very creative things, share data, but the focus of that was supporting people and their families in our community. So when you find the really core thing that you've got to do, you can bring people together because it's not about them, it's about the community and people and the future of people in that community. It is possible. That Trades and Labour Council has now spoken all over the world about the work that they've done. So that's pretty good. So you've just got to demonstrate a different way and have a trust and partnership and relationship and respect in terms of who you work with. But it's careful work and it takes skill.
Thank you, Karen, and indeed, Jonathan. One more question, and because we don't want to get to the end of the day and not give people a fair amount of time.
Okay, we both had a question actually, sorry. I actually asked a panel this question earlier, but I wanted to hear your response as well. With biodiversity and climate crises are obviously very deeply intertwined, and we don't really have a lot of time for either of them. So I wanted to hear your opinion on how maybe we can bring biodiversity more into the conversation, as well as the embodied carbon side of things.
Okay, would you like to answer that one, Anna?
Yeah, but I've got colleagues at Pollination that specialise in nature and commissioned the legal opinion, the Noel Hutley legal opinion that found that directors have a duty to consider nature risk. So colleagues heavily invested and involved in nature, and one of my smart colleagues describes nature as infrastructure because it provides so many services. And so the more I think we can crystallise the understanding of the role of nature in the built environment as a provider of services, whether it's sound cushioning, air cleaning, water provision. There's so many services that we should then be willing to spend money on, because absent the provision of those services through nature, we're wildly dependent on them. There is certainly the twin crises in marking through your strategy to secure materials. Often there are downstream value chain implications for nature. Increasingly, this is a crystallised director duty that requires a considered response and a evaluation of risks for any continuing exposures. But more practically, there is, I think, a really important place for understanding the significance of the impact that you have and how material it is in the context of your other impacts. And, we hear a lot about circularity, particularly as it relates to materials and the importance of reducing emissions through considered use of input goods and feedstocks and so on. More often, the emissions implication is highest as it relates to burning stuff. And so it's fundamentally energy use that shapes the adverse impact. And so if you have an outcome that reduces the energy consumption and has a material downward pressure on your emissions, maybe there are trade-offs that you are prepared to make. But the first thing is having a really clear-eyed understanding of your impacts, the adverse exposures, and doing everything within your power to minimise those.
Great, thanks very much. A final comment from Joan.
Yes, so professional licensing. Shegol Weir, through the Building Confidence report and through building quality crisis, those sorts of things, have recommended that there's really broad-based licensing right throughout the construction and built environment workplaces. And it's really kind of critical. Architects have been licensed in Australia for 100 years in most jurisdictions. But that doesn't exist for a lot of the other built environment professionals who are part of that ecosystem. In fact, engineers are just sort of starting to get on board with licensing just very recently. There are 60 professional competencies for architects that we need to maintain, and interestingly, they have all sorts of parameters, including being able to deal with both operational and embodied carbon, biodiversity, caring for country, working with First Nations peoples, all of those sorts of things. So I think we need to get a lot more people who are working in the built environment and making decisions about the future of our cities, having the right sorts of competencies to make those decisions.
Thank you very much. I agree. I will draw it to a close. I feel very lucky that I asked people and they accepted, and the combination was just amazing. I think we covered a lot of this huge territory in some way or other. So thank you so much to the panel. And please, if you're able to, let's talk in the next break with everyone else. Anna, do you want to take us to, or am I doing that? Okay. I've failed to bring the clicker with me. So the next sessions, are these following on pretty much straight away, Anna? Straight away. So thank you again, everyone, and hopefully see you in the next session. Bye.